My name is Gaja Jarosz, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Linguistics department. It's my 5th year here. What I'm mainly interested in is the very general question of how children learn language. And specifically, I look at this in the domain of phonology and the learning of sound patterns, how children manage to do that in the brief time that they have.
This is your most recent paper, most recent research, children and learning language and word boundaries in that topic. So you study Polish, Turkish, and English.
Yes.
So were those children, you went out, is that sort of like the fieldwork aspect, you went out and asked children here or like internationally? I feel like you were
Well, actually the data that we used was derived from an already existing collection process that came before our study. So other researchers had already gone and done the very difficult and long, labor-intensive work of recording children and transcribing what they're saying and transcribing what the adults around them are saying, and doing this for weeks and weeks, creating that data. And so this had been done for the 3 languages that we looked at, for Polish, Turkish, and English. And we were interested in looking at various properties of that speech that the adults in the transcripts were using. So a lot of the time that kind of data is used to figure out what the children are doing. We were sort of taking a different part of that data, looking at what the adults were actually saying, which is the input that's being given to the children for learning language, right? And trying to figure out what are the properties of that input. The 3 languages are, we thought were a nice group to look at because they are very different in many ways, and so we can look at to what extent these different properties of the input differ across languages more generally, because these are different in, for example, with respect to their morphological structure. So English has a little bit of morphological complexity. So just to be clear what I mean by morphological complexity, so I'm talking here about when you sort of inflect words into different categories. So nouns, for example, have plural and singular. In English we just have plural and singular for nouns. We don't have case, for example, which is another kind of morphological category that other languages have. Polish has, for example. Verbs will have different endings depending on tense and tense and number and gender and things like this. And English has a little bit of these endings changing, these suffixes changing, but other languages have a lot more extensive system of morphology, and Turkish is one such language. And Polish has a kind of different system that's also very rich inflectionally. That changes the kind of input that the children are receiving, and trying to parse the input into separable words kind of interacts with this morphological complexity, because those morphemes themselves have to be parsed eventually by children. So it kind of makes things a bit harder when there's a lot of morphology going on to try to figure out which are the morphemes, which are the words. So that's one example of how languages can differ.
So the properties you're looking at are morphology, but also what other properties are you looking for in parsing speech?
Sure. So maybe I can say just a little bit more about the problem of word segmentation that we were looking at. So as I guess you've noticed that you looked at the paper and have thought about it a bit, but when we first start learning language, we don't know where the word boundaries are, right? So when we look at a written text, there are spaces between the words, and one might think that when you hear language, you sort of have the same perception, that it kind of seems like that the words are separated from one another. But in reality, if you look at the acoustic signal, there aren't pauses between words. So you have to learn, the words just run together, they're just a stream. So you have to learn somehow to figure out where the boundaries are. And children do this very, very early on. So before they're a year old, before they can talk, they are able to do this task of separating words out. And you can sort of get a good sense for how how hard this problem is if you think about hearing language that you don't know. So if you, I don't know what language you know in particular, but if you think of some random language, probably if I started speaking Polish, right? Just speaking Polish quickly to you, it would just sound like a big long stream, and you wouldn't know where to put the boundaries. So that's what kids have to figure out, and they have to learn in each language how to do that. So that's the problem of word segmentation, and I think it's a very interesting problem for various reasons, but one of them is that the sorts of cues that children ultimately use to figure out where the word boundaries are create a kind of chicken and egg problem for the learner, which is very interesting. So, for example, one of the kinds of cues that we use once we learn a little bit about the language to figure out where word boundaries is the stress pattern, so where the accents fall on the word. And in general, languages tend to place accents toward the edges of words, so on the first syllable or the last syllable, or second to last, second syllable, things like that. So they're sort of attracted to edges, so they help us identify where the word boundary is. But we don't know when we're first learning the language where that stress is attracted to. So for example, in English, initial syllables tends to be the stressed one. So when we hear a stressed syllable, we sort of can expect it to be more likely that the word boundary is before that syllable. But in French, the opposite is true. So if we have a disyllabic word with 2 syllables, it's going to be the second syllable that's usually stressed. And so you'd be more likely to put a boundary after the stressed syllable rather than before. So you have to learn this problem, and you kind of have to learn both the problems at the same time. You have to figure out, it seems like you have to know the word boundaries in order to figure out where the stress go, but you want to know the stress in order to figure out where the word boundaries are. So this is the chicken and egg problem. It's not just with stress, but with other cues as well, that this chicken and egg problem exists, and this is a very interesting problem, how children manage to overcome it.
Right, so morphology, stress.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
coming back to your question. So yeah, morphology is one of the things we looked at as a kind of parameter that along which the languages we looked at differ, but it wasn't the sort of the question of focus for the paper. So the question that we really wanted to address in the paper was to see to what extent different kinds of cues that could be calculated from this input are actually present in real language data that children get as they're learning language, and how informative they can be for learning words. So there's been a huge amount of work in developmental psychology, experimental work with infants, showing how various cues can be used by infants. So in this work, they manipulate certain properties of an artificial speech stream, and then they show that infants are sensitive to this particular property of the speech stream. And this is very important work because it shows that what infants can pay attention to and learn and what they can't. But it leaves open the question of whether these particular properties are really there in the language input. So that's a sort of complementary question that we were addressing in this paper, trying to figure out to what extent these different cues are there in naturally occurring data when it's not sort of manipulated for the experiment, and also once they're there, how informative are they? So if a child was relying on these cues to learn word boundaries, how successful could they possibly be? Is it kind of a viable strategy for learning? So those were the main questions to try to figure out how informative and actually present were these cues across multiple languages.
So how exactly did you measure that? I know I read in the paper, but I'm still a little confused. So you'd have random strings of nonsense language, and then you'd apply a cue in the string and see how they would pick up on it?
Well, so that the experimental studies that I was referring to, the developmental psychology studies, that's what they do. They sort of create an artificial language stream with a certain pattern in it. and then see whether infants are sort of picking up on that pattern, because that's the only thing that's in the input. So if they're detecting a difference, then it's because of that. What we were doing was looking at real transcripts of real speech to children. So what the children were actually hearing. Obviously, what we had is not going to be the entire speech that the children heard over their lifetime, but it gives us a sample of what the speech actually looks like that they're listening to. So we have transcriptions of what the adults were saying to the children, how they, that's what we were using to calculate the cues from. So I can give you an example of a cue to make this more concrete.
Yeah.
So one kind of cue that has been investigated a lot and shown that in studies to be something children are sensitive to is called a transitional probability cue. And what that is referring to is that if you have sounds, so phonemes, a sequence is the input is a sequence of phonemes. So let's say the input is my dog is happy, right? Something very simple. So transitional probability is going to look at each phoneme and calculate over the input what's the probability of seeing one phoneme given that the other one, the previous one, is what it is. So for example, in my dog is happy, we might start at ah for dog, and what's the probability of seeing ah after duh? And then move on to the next position. What's the probability of seeing g after ah? And so forth. And the basic idea behind this cue is that overall, this is sort of telling you how cohesive two phonemes are with one another. So how likely are they to co-occur, right? If you have words in the language, which all languages have, then phonemes within words will tend to cohere together, and phonemes across word boundaries would be less cohesive. So the idea is that if you track these statistics, which infants have been shown to be able to do, that the probabilities will be low, or sort of the following phonemes will be surprising when you're at a word boundary, but not as surprising, and the probability would be higher within a word. Right. So the question we wanted to look at is to actually see what are the statistics of such cues in the input that children get, and how informative could they be about where the word boundaries are. So are they going to be, are the dips in probability actually going to occur at word boundaries, or is it going to be very noisy and very unreliable? And we looked at such informativeness of a large variety of cues. So not just the bigram, the transitional probability bigram that I mentioned, but 176 cues actually varied in different ways. Cues that have been investigated in the experimental literature, but we wanted to see how informative they are in this input to children, and how that varies across 3 languages that we looked at.
Is there anything, some other point that you think is like most important to get from the paper that you haven't mentioned yet? You had already mentioned like your major finding, and you're building off of that, but if there's anything else you think would be particularly important for, like, say, art readers to get from this?
I think I probably mentioned it already, but just the result that it looks like in order to do word segmentation using these kinds of cues that are kids might be exploiting multiple cues, and so looking at how those will interact and how children might be combining the information from multiple cues. And the other really important thing is to look at languages besides English, because a lot of work has been, a lot of models have been tested on English in particular, but don't work quite so well on other languages. So I take that as a very important question, is to make sure that we know how children do this in other languages as well, because obviously they do learn other languages too. So we need to have a good understanding of how it works across different languages.